Hello, everyone. I'll give you a second to get connected to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1216th New Social Environment. I'm Magley, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Rose Salane and Blake Oetting. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Hala Hasham, Wei Huang, Kaleha Kagode, and Christina Shen are four of the six curators of Rose Salane, Periphery, and Red, Yellow, Blue, the subject of today's conversation. Rose Salane works with accumulated sets of objects from individuals, auctions, and institutions, exploring memory and reflecting on life in urban environments. Salane completed her MA in urban planning at Bernard and Ann Spitzer School of Architecture, CUNY in 2020, and her BFA at the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art in 2014. Salane's work has been exhibited internationally. And our host today, Blake Oetting, is a PhD candidate at New York University, where his research focuses on the legacies of conceptual art and institutional critique. In 2023 and 2024, he was a critical studies participant in the Whitney Independent Study Program. His past and forthcoming writing can be found in Oxford Art Journal, Criticism, Flash Art, November, and the Brooklyn Rail, as well as various exhibition catalogs. His book on Tom Burr's Torrington project will be published with primary information this fall. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Hala to get us started.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Hala Hashim, and I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce to you the 2025 Great Hall Exhibition Curatorial Team, which includes myself, Angelina Medina, Christina Shen, Kaleha Kagode, Marissa Sanquini, and Wei Huang. And today we have Christina, Kaleha, and Wei. Founded in 2013, the annual Great Hall exhibition showcases prominent contemporary artists in the Mirza Vilcek Great Hall and James B. Duke House. The historic landmark building provides a fantastic and impressive setting for displaying innovative works of art by women artists in the center of the Institute's academic home and community. And this year, the Great Hall exhibition celebrates Rose Salane.
The Great Hall exhibition provides selected graduate student curators, the six of us, to gain hands-on curatorial experience. Unfortunately, Marissa and Angelina couldn't make it today, but this means that we produce written materials to promote the show and didactic materials on site and online. In the lead up to the show, the curatorial team had the opportunity to engage with the Forbes Pigment collection in the Conservation Center, with our research informing the curatorial path to get to this point. Additional contributions by the curatorial team include arranging the opening reception, spearheaded by Kaleha and Hala. Christina and I have organized a panel discussion, and we hope that you will return on May 5th at 6:30 p.m. when Rose will be in conversation with Lisa Conte, co-chair of the Conservation Center, and Vaijanti Rao, anthropologist, writer, and curator currently teaching at the Yale School of Architecture. Angelina and Marissa have played a pivotal role in the publicity for the show and its related programs.
The exhibition could not have been possible without a number of people who we would like to give thanks to. Firstly, Valeria Napoleone for her ongoing support of the Great Hall exhibition series, which to date has featured such artists as Linda Benglis, Xaviera Simmons, Colleen Smith, and most recently Maya Ruth Lee. We would also like to thank Commonwealth and Council Los Angeles, Kibum Kim, and Myung Lee. A Foundation for Contemporary Arts emergency grant provided crucial production and fabrication support. Thank you also to many IFA faculty and staff, including Jason Dubbs, Sarah Higby, Nadia Rivers, Adam Ryder, Lisa Barrow, Matthew Hayes, and Lisa Conti. Thank you to Jason Verone for designing our website, and thank you to Catherine Kwan-Damon and Director Joan Keefe for their immense support.
Finally, a big thank you to Rose Salane. Salane works with what she calls dynamic sets, objects once held by individuals and institutions alike, to reflect on the intricacies of value and exchange, personal attachments, and sentiments around loss. In Periphery in red, yellow, blue, Salane weaves complex histories of colonialism, industrialization, and exploitation with research, revealing how objects and technology hold memory, narrate history, and reveal systems of movement and organization of urban life. The newly commissioned works include a structural reimagining of traffic light lenses, former Institute study materials, and select elements from the Forbes pigment collection housed at the Conservation Center. It has been a pleasure getting to know Rose, getting to work with her on the Great Hall exhibition and her process. Please welcome Rose.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy to be in conversation with Blake. And I am so grateful that the Brooklyn Rail had reached out and asked us to do this talk.
Yeah, thanks to everyone at the Brooklyn Rail for inviting me to be in conversation with Rose today, and thanks for the introduction to the show and for all the work that the curators at the IFA put together to make this happen. So, Rose, I wanted to start off with a question about the context of the exhibition being at the Institute of Fine Arts. So if we think about your dynamic sets as, involving a process or a method that's always concerned with the question of conservation, of determining which materials are kept, which materials are valorized, and which are discarded. I thought it was, potentially a very interesting place for you to have a show because it's an institution devoted to a discipline, or two twinned disciplines, that of art history and art conservation, that are explicitly focused on the question of kind of like determining value, which objects should be remembered, which objects might be discarded. And so I wanted to, I guess it's in a way, it's a question about art history, but how you thought about that overarching context in approaching the site of the IFA.
Yeah, I think, well, I would say maybe let me define what I am sort of interested in with the dynamic set, because that is almost, it's usually an accumulation of objects that reflect a set of forces that have developed their accumulation. So when I was in the IFA, and between the IFA and the Conservation Center, I was locating all of these, let's say, dynamic sets. So that's the Forbes pigment collection, which are these incredible pigments that have been collected through this philanthropist, Edward Waldo Forbes, who used to be the curator of the Fogg Art Museum and Harvard's Fogg Art Museum during the early 1900s. And he would go around the world visiting friends and family members and essentially collecting pigments based on people he knew in different places of the world. But that pigment accumulation was quite dynamic in the sense that he was collecting natural pigments and pigments that would be used to date paintings from, 14th, 15th century paintings, and those would be in his collection. So, but these pigments reflected place and reflected the sources of sort of, I would say, sources of really long lineages of history that show up in painting and pigments. So that's like one example that I was what I was dealing with this engagement. But then there's conservator reports and conservator studies that are also these really interesting investigations into what is this painting made up of pigment wise or material wise, and how can we conserve it? So in that also way, that's sort of a loose example, but meaning like that established set isn't there by way of a you know purposeful collection, but it's actually there based on the time and the movement of a student body within an institution. So specifically, I was working with conservation reports from previous students that were at the IFA, and the range of time was I was looking at this filing cabinet that held uh, conservative reports from the 60s until like the early 2000s, and you can see the range of, technology through the typewriter, the printed report, the handwritten report, and but these are again sets that I'm interested in of um of information and also sort of different levels of power and periphery. So I would say that that is that's sort of how I engage with a place. And then this specific institute had allowed this engagement because of its relationship to this type of knowledge.
Mhm. Right. Um, and then the installation that we're seeing now, which is composed of these decommissioned traffic lights, it might be helpful too, just in terms of setting up our conversation today, that you talk a little bit about that dynamic set, where that
Mhm.
comes from, and why it was attractive to use in this context.
Right, yeah. So that dynamic set comes in as as an outside um sort of finding because I had acquired these traffic lights from a New York City auction, and they were housed in specifically the New York City Department of Administrative Services, which receives a lot of different um surplus items from different city agencies around New York. And this came from the Department of Transportation, and they had some exchange where they're like, we need to basically be able to auction these items off. They are no longer in use. They're decommissioned traffic light lenses. Currently, the whole city is covered with mostly LED lenses. And I was really fascinated by these objects because they exist, or they once existed, powering the grid, controlling the grid, and also directing movement. And I brought this object in to this exhibition because I was thinking about color and thinking about this color in Periphery, which is the title of the exhibition. Um, and I thought, having this within the Great Hall would be an incredibly playful, but also um, doing this thing that I like to do, which is sort of bringing the street within the institutional context and showing that there's all these power objects out there, and then when they're removed from their site of power and sort of re-shown and retreated within a sculptural installation. There's so much play that can happen, and there's so much this set it becomes charged again in a different way. But then also sort of to open up this connection between the pigments and the conservation reports and the actual location of this building within New York City, I thought it was appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. And um, I want to think about the traffic lights a little bit longer. So what's perhaps one way you can think about them, like you were talking about them as emblems that were interesting to you because of their color, because of their kind of monochromy, and the way that they break up the otherwise, sort of beige space of the Great Hall at the IFA. So they have these very particular formal qualities, right? They have a sheen, they refract light in specific ways. Um, they remind me of sort of the Finnish fetish aesthetic of 1960s minimalism in California with someone like Larry Bell or someone like that. But at the same time, those formal qualities are offset or are put into contestation with this sort of more maybe poetic or metaphorical allusions that one conjures once you realize that they're traffic lights. So there's, on one hand, a whole breadth of, very sensuous visual response that one might have when seeing the installation, but at the same time, that's quickly, put in dialogue with what a traffic light does. It directs movement. It allows you to enter, which is why I think it's particularly interesting that this is installed in the entrance hall of the IFA. It might tell you to stop. For instance, you can't quite see it here, but in the photo on the left of the desk, just to the left, is like it's a security desk, which allows people to come in or to not come in. It might tell people to be cautious about moving. And so there's also this, this sort of kinetics that the work helps produce. And so I wanted to ask about how you actually balance that as the artist between, letting these forms be forms and letting these forms, have like sort of express whatever sort of aesthetic qualities you're interested in, but at the same time, how you balance that with their metaphorical qualities, the associations that they conjure.
Yeah, I think I meditate a lot when I receive these objects. I meditate on them. I meditate on their previous uses and what their sort of banal states are right now. So I was very obsessed with this collection of traffic light lenses because if you think about it, it's also this truth, and in reality, they are literally like the sort of almost these like contact lenses that are taken directly out of the city grid and they have fallen out. And if you imagine what does the city look like when there's no control and when these traffic lights are not controlling anything. I mean, I've been in cities where the traffic light is ignored completely. Cairo, for example, I remember just driving and it's really, you just have to really pay attention to those that are what the person in front of you is doing. And so I'm really interested in how this sort of this object leaves its site. It goes through a very bureaucratic process of departure where I am sort of yanking it out of that bureaucracy and really hoping to be able to work with it within an art context and also show that this object that used to be in a specific position just a little bit above us, moving our day, specifically in New York, is now a new state, and then it's a new state because it's coming out of a previous use and it's no longer in use based on the advancements of technology, and the smart city, and there's no actual light bulb within the traffic light. Now it's the LED, like I mentioned. So but I do want to stress that when I find these objects, they're coming out of very, I guess dynamic is the word too. These dynamic and kind of funny truths, like as in you just wouldn't expect to see this in this state. And I have a lot of those object sets that I like to deal with.
Hmm. Right. Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. I mean, the question of light comes up, I think. There's a lot to deal with in the architectural container of the IFA, as I think people probably see just even in this image. Um, the light, I think, is one I wanted to ask about more because of the material that you're using. I mean, I thought about light in a few ways when I was viewing the show. One is that when you enter the door, or when you enter the building, there's a photogram directly to your left,
Mhm.
which is like this cameraless photographic process, where my understanding is that these same traffic lights were exposed on photosensitive paper, and that's how you create this photogram. But it also has this interesting relationship with the architecture of the site, because when you open the door, you sort of let in this cascade of light that then falls
Right.
onto the photo. And then there's another dynamic here with these rather ornate chandeliers, which are the lighting source for the installation environment that you're working within. So did that feel like something you had to wrestle with a lot, or did it come together rather organically?
I think, well, I knew I wanted to introduce the show with that photogram because I think that photogram had a big place within this project when I previously showed this project in uh, Athens, Georgia, at the University of Georgia, where I had a larger series of photograms that were of these traffic light lenses, and the traffic light lenses were on the floor. But that photogram in the entryway is exactly what you mentioned. It's like this sort of um, pretty hard truth of what this object is capable of doing when you expose it to photography. And I guess also using the light that is so prominent within taking a photo and actually just having that be the exact um, the sort of the directional uh the word I'm looking for is like um it's just this one-to-one action where the light is passing through the object and then you have that object document itself through its own properties where I think and it's just an kind for me it was an incredible way to see the multifaceted uses of this traffic light, meaning you can there's also a whole color situation happening because when you do pass light through it, it's
Mm.
going to show you the opposite color. So blue is going to go to red and based on the spectrum. And going back to the, did I kind of prepare all of these effects for the space? I sometimes just intuitively allow the initial architectural plan and then the object itself to sort of guide me because there's so many restrictions with this landmarked building that I was like, okay, how do I work around all these restrictions? I have to make sure all of these pieces are freestanding. There was only the opportunity of hanging maybe a few pieces on pre-existing uh, screws that are in the walls if you cannot move anything. So I was really grappling with that. And this is the piece in the atrium, like when you first, or sorry, this is the piece in the entryway when you first walk in. Um, that is a freestanding piece. So I think that ended up, I thought about the city so much actually within this reality of not, you can't rely on the walls of the institution. I have to basically arrive with everything freestanding. And this piece specifically, I remember I was walking out of the IFA one day and I was just looking at all of the scaffolding around New York, which is continuously there. And I was interested in how it was held up. And I just emulated that for this stand for the traffic light lenses. And then I was thinking about how this industrial, very simple industrial materials like the I-beam and then um, steel actually really aesthetically cut the Baroque interior in a way that was, for me, effective. And I had never done before within an institution because I haven't really worked in an institution like this where there was a significant amount of rules and also a very uh, decadent interior. But that was also that's a lot of it in the best way possible, kind of push the work even further with the traffic light lenses actually becoming sculptural versus just becoming a state of fallen in the previous exhibition in Georgia.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because like, the infrastructure behind the show, the various supports that you use with this work and then the works in the Loeb Room, which were the ones growing out of your work in the Conservation Center, um, they are themselves, in a way, a mark of the limits or the constraints of the envelope in which you were working. In a way, I think it's a practice or something that you're doing all the time. I mean, you might call your work, like a process-based practice that relates to that's focused on municipal bureaucracy in a way, and like the results of your work is often a sort of distorted mirror of those bureaucratic processes that you're intervening into. And so I think it's interesting to think about the presentation of the work not only as something that comes from your sense of composition, but also from the sense of institutional delimitations of
Mhm.
what's possible within a site that's historically marked.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, I think that again, those limits have very much pushed me into new relationships with space, with what's possible within my own practice, and showing pieces amid these obstacles. And but then I also think like with the bureaucraticness of the engagements I deal with, those also are the same obstacles in many regards, where maybe there's an object that I can't achieve. I
Right, right.
lose objects all the time. Like there's auctions that I don't win. There's people I don't come in contact with at the right time, and um, there's always things I miss within that way of working. But you figure out how to get around it, I think. And and I think what I learned from this situation was that, or with this engagement, was that there's so much to unfold, and there's especially in institutions that are really dedicated to very finite types of knowledge and research. It's incredible the things that you can find. So these are the Forbes pigments installed in the lecture hall, which is just right next to the Great Hall. I mean, this building too, as you mentioned, is a it's one of these Gilded Age buildings that are build Gilded Age private homes that was built in the early 1900s, and I believe, and it lines Fifth Avenue in the way that the a lot of these families that were moving into New York and in that time period, it reflects that era, like the Whitneys and the Carnegies and their homes as well. And also, it's a very direct relationship to European homes, specifically in France, I believe. There's a direct copy of this building there. So, I mean, that's another layer of history too that is so prevalent within the entire space. Like we're in a residential, or we're in a very decadent residential home of a very wealthy um, tobacco dealer, and um, it's interesting to see how the space functions actually around that history. And that history obviously has such a residue within the size of each room, the location of um, uh, I, even the dressing room that was made for the the wife of the Duke family. These things are quite compelling within the building. So I'm thinking through them as I'm making this entire exhibition happen. And I think also for a lot of artists, the question of like how far do I go into these histories, realities, and conditions within a space? Like how much is too much and how much is too little? And so those are things I was thinking about a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's thinking about the specificity of the site uh, in terms of its physicality and, the ornate decoration that is very clear in these installation photos. And as you were just mentioning, there's this more, I mean, maybe it's not entirely immaterial, but this history of the Duke family, their wealth, and the fact that now this is a part of, NYU's robust real estate portfolio. It's a vexed site in many ways, and because of its location, I've always felt that in being, a student there for the past 6 years, that divide between the private space of NYU graduate students within the building is so stark because it's on a very public street, Fifth Avenue. Central Park's right across the street. The Met is right there. And so that discrepancy is even more accented here. And so if we go back to the traffic lights for a little bit, which I think contains so much of these themes that we're talking about, that idea of directing movement, of a red light stopping someone, a green light letting someone in, um, feel so related to the function of the building as a site of instruction for a particular group of people.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, when I was working on planning out the traffic light installation, I remember at night I had walked by the IFA and was able to look through the door. Obviously, it wasn't open, but you can peer into the Great Hall, which is what that previous image was sort of showing from even from where the security, a little behind or before the security desk. And I was just, when I was thinking of the traffic lights and the whole composition, I thought, it'd be kind of interesting to really show this just like chaos with that object, and show it in a way where you're not even able to access it, but you can have it be accessed visually for a split second, which I feel is a lot of the sort of the frustrations with those types of buildings, and also with just time in general, and what sort of institutions are able to uh, what institutions are able to hold on to, and what people are not actually able to access um, uh, based on a lot of things, based on how much it costs to get into a museum and all of this. And I just thought, like, having that kind of moment of just color and pop, and at least you could see it from the door if you walked up to it.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense because it's we talked about a little about this yesterday when we were, when we were talking about this conversation. But it must be a sort of, it's an odd place in which to plan an exhibition. It must be because of the sense of the question of publicness and who's actually engaging with the work, how they're engaging with it. So I think it's really interesting that you were sort of thinking about viewership like through the window
Mhm.
rather than being in front of these installations yourself.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that you can do through that gaze, as we were kind of mentioning, with when you just walk through the neighborhood and you look into other people's windows, or,
Yeah.
it's a lot of there's a little spark of like, what is that, or what energy does that bring, or, what kind of almost voyeurism does that ignite?
Definitely. And the other thing that if we're going to, keep on this thematic of publicness, privateness, and the fact that this is on a campus, of course, it brings to mind like the status of like campus life and campus architecture, specifically in New York, quite prominently, at least to me now, that, campuses are being, securitized
Mhm.
um, in a very aggressive way. The campus architecture I see sort of cropping up are these downtown are these giant plywood walls around the business school at NYU. There's a huge proliferation of cameras and guardrails, and so the traffic light feels maybe less charged in a certain way. It's maybe more of a pedestrian everyday material, but it nevertheless feels involved in that the dynamic of how bodies move, which bodies are allowed to move. And so I think it's so effective that one can see it at this sort of liminal space in the entryway between entrance and exit.
Mhm.
Um, but that's a lot about the site in particular. But I wanted to see also how these same traffic light lenses in different sites have maybe taken on different valences for you. So these were also shown at the University of Georgia. And so how did that installation feel different from this one?
Yeah, so this, I mean, it's another example of me, or the first example of me bringing in these traffic light lenses and um, showing their first appearance. And actually, it's kind of, for me, a little bit interesting to see that they begin in a very still composition, and then for the IFA, they rise up as in almost like a performative dance position. And for me, that's exciting because I actually haven't been able to have a project where I use the object twice in two different ways. But in this exhibition, I don't know if we have the slides actually for it. I also paired this with a set of archives that were from the University of Georgia and in their holdings that were much more reflective of the South, the Civil War era, the kind of the beginnings of very intense power that were happening within the United States, um, and and like very hardcore divides, obviously, that took place during the Civil War. And um, that was this object again was able to, or allowed me to open up these very complicated um, archives and actually use light to sort of find a discourse. So the slides that we don't have, I realize, is I had found these diary entries that were written during the Civil War, right at the end of the Civil War, the last year, and they are all documenting a solar eclipse that is taking place, and it's from four different perspectives, from a woman, a Union soldier, I believe, a farmer, and a child. And I was really thinking about, whose voices are documented. There's a huge reality of people that are not even taught how to write, and just thinking about preservation and who is able to even be preserved within history, with their voices being preserved within history. So just as an example, this object allows me to, or somehow guides me into being able to work with these pretty complicated archives. Because I think this object also, the traffic light, as is the object I'm referring to, is a really universal experience of control, of also even sort of play in a weird way. And yeah, so this iteration was my first, but then the IFA iteration was much more of an installation focused approach, but also had helped me figure out color and figure out the sort of the even the politics around color as well.
Yeah, that's sort of where I wanted to move to next, because I think that's within the IFA exhibition, something that maybe gets fleshed out vis-a-vis the exhibition at Georgia, which is that there's one way of thinking about that the traffic lights almost as like these jewels that adorn that adorn the Great Hall. They're beautiful and they have a clear sheen to them, but because of the way that you're tracing the etymologies and sort of colonial legacies of the pigments that are housed in the Forbes collection. The politics of color are like quite front and center. And so color is not merely this sort of formal interest of yours in the exhibition, but it's also something that takes on a legacy as a highly politicized category of perception, both within the history of art, but also just more generally within the history of trade and sort of global expansion. So I wanted to, give a chance to talk about your work in the conservation archives and how maybe the color of the traffic lights ended up becoming aligned with this more conceptual political history that you found through the pigments.
Yeah, I mean, I think the pigments are a really interesting set. I mean, that's, how we started speaking
Yeah.
initially at the beginning of the talk. They're just, for me, they're these little bottles of place that have been extracted by like by philanthropic forces that is so common in the early tourism around the world and archaeology around the world in the early 1900s. And then they sort of reflect sites and place and also natural material in such a strange way. It's like it could be these pieces could, or these bottles could be in a cabinet somewhere, and it's just, imagine stumbling upon that in someone's home and you're like, what are these?
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, if we can go to the slide with the cochineal, I think that's a good example of the like one of the oldest pigments used. So this is a bottle that's has very little amount of cochineal in it, but cochineal is a female insect that lives on, it's almost like a lice that lives on cactus, and it generates this amazing pinkish red dye. And it's one of the oldest pigments used in the Americas, and it's dating to the second century BC, I think. And It was, used in rituals of Maya and Aztec peoples and all throughout Central and South America. So, I mean, I just think, the collections of these insects are so compelling, and also this I don't know exactly when this was collected by, but I imagine it was like a pre World War II collection, because I think the Forbes was only at Harvard until 1944, I believe. And and this is an example of a encapsulated, I would say also power object. Um, but then you have other objects that are, or sorry, other pigments within this that are um, also from there's a pigment that's Pompeii blue, and I believe it says that yeah, it's similar to Egyptian blue, which Egyptian blue is I believe, the earliest synthetic pigment, because different alloys were actually mixed in to create its stability in Egypt. And again, like, I just think that these are when I think about power too, it's just the longevity and the durability um, of an object and the identity of an object across time. And it's just kind of incredible that, these brilliant colors have been around since, I guess, I think the earliest colors like 250,000 years ago, in the red families. But it's just incredible to know that this is how we were expressing ourselves, and through the ability of just, combining nature and the excretions that would happen through, again, naturally occurring phenomenons.
Yeah.
So
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
no, that's all.
Okay, cool. I mean, I was thinking and looking at this, quite small, diminutive, vial of pigment that, the question of scale, I think, comes up in your work quite a bit,
Yeah.
in that a lot of what you're looking at are very small things, like the rings from the work. I believe it's called Panorama.
Yes,
Yeah.
the Panorama 94
Or the
is,
coins that were shown in the biennial, or these small vials of pigment, and yet they're these sort of portals that open out onto extraordinarily expansive, huge histories, right? So it's something that continually I remark on in your work, is this question of scale, about how, the fragment opens onto the total, or and I wanted to ask you about that, if there's something, if there's a poetics there that you're attracted to in particular, or if that's something I'm kind of ascribing on to the work.
no, I think it's so poignant, because I think with the ring specifically, there's a parallel to even the pigments too. It's like, what are we able to save over a period of time? And it could be a long, long, long period of time. So with the ring project, I have so many different versions of this ring project, but the first one comes with, at auction, I had purchased a set of 94 rings that were lost on the New York City subway system between 2016 and 2018. And when I had first acquired that, this is back in 2018, and when I first really started working with objects in this way, I was so compelled by the power that was held within each ring, even though the rings had no real material value. So, if they weren't gold, they weren't really that valuable. But just the way that they were lost was incredible, and it's such a tiny object of sentiment. And I think these objects can speak volumes about movement, time, and the velocity of loss within environments, especially urban environments, because you're getting so many different um, speeds and people, and sort of like moving together. And I think that that's always so fascinating to me. And that comes back to this dynamic set situation that I'm trying to sort of iron out through even an artist text that I do hope to write. But I think we see this basically in mathematics. There's something called dynamical systems. And in physics as well, it's like there's a dynamic state. And we see that through like the motion of air particles, where I'm just fascinated on how that's able to be detected. And I'm really interested in how these dynamic sets they basically reveal states of time and the effect of motion on an object. And so usually the scale of these objects needs to be sort of small because that collection will happen faster, I've noticed, or happen a little bit or happen more in repetition. And that's what I'm really interested too, because with the ring project, these accumulations of objects, they happen across time. I had done this residency in Pompeii where I was able to look at more rings that were lost and recovered based on the fact that they just were actually gold and they didn't melt during the volcanic eruption, because gold has a specific melting point that exceeded what actually was the heat during that day. And so yeah, and I'm really interested in this repetitious object that through forces create this accumulation. And the forces could be very, hardcore and damaging, like a natural disaster, like war, or they could be very casual, where it could just be a commute.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, and I think this idea of repetition, seriality, points towards a sort of aesthetic inheritance that I think you're playing with. One might call it conceptualism, but I think it's even more specifically a kind of outgrowth of conceptualism that you're following in and contributing to, which is this interest in how to insert subjectivity, um, psychology, perspective, um, into what are otherwise very cold, anodyne systems.
mhm,
And so even while, yeah, like for instance, like the work that we're seeing now, that was shown at the Whitney, like the presentation is rather stark, um, and text driven, but there is a huge sort of affective, emotional punch once you dig into that system and realize what exactly you're gathering together. And so I wanted to ask a little bit about that, about your relationship to what was otherwise called like information art, things that can be seen as very dry, that I think you produce more emotion with. I mean, we talk about this, how Adrian Edwards has referred to your work and others as lush conceptualism. So maybe we could
mhm.
talk a little bit about why that phrasing is attractive to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was trying to describe the traffic lights earlier on with these banal truths, that's what I think with the luscious conceptualism that Adrian speaks about is there's these, for me at least, in the work I'm doing, there's these truths and these settings in public that I find that these objects reflect so well. Where, again, when I'm trying to describe that velocity that physics speaks about so beautifully and mathematics defines, that velocity of these objects are so important because, or the velocity is important, and then also these objects are encapsulations of time that are these sort of these sediments of time that we don't even remember often. So, for example, in the coins, these are non-currencies that were used to pay for bus fare. I bought these at auction as well. Um, and they don't have any monetary value, and they were passed through the system, but they were retrieved from people's pockets and held in on people and their possessions for who knows how long. And maybe the people that were paying for this for the bus with coins wouldn't even know that they were actually paying with a coin that wasn't a valid currency, or maybe they did. So, but regardless, these coins mark places that people were once passing through. So, for example, there's arcade and casino tokens. There are religious tokens from specific churches. There's flattened pennies from tourist destinations. And I think that these minute objects, again, they hold this periphery in memory in such a compelling way. Whereas it'd be almost impossible to track that in another way, or through another medium. Um, and again, going back to the truth of it, where I think what I'm really interested in is this object that holds a public, banal truth, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what's bringing to mind is that book by Michel de Certeau, The Practice of Everyday Life. It seems like an important background for your work. So can we go back to the picture of the rings for a second? Or the picture of the work panorama? Yeah, that's perfect. Because I also wanted to ask about, what your investigations into these, sort of um, rudimentary public truths that these objects conjure, um, how they're explicated here. So I think value is a very important term to you and to your work, both like in terms of the financial sense of a value, because you had these appraised at a pawn shop, I believe, to think about what their pecuniary value is, which I think for the most part was very low or nothing at all.
Yeah.
And then you also had an intuitive reader sit with each ring and think about what came to mind about the person who once wore it. And so I think something that might have been written about your work is that you like reinvest these objects with value. But I think more what I see in a work like this is that you're sort of like setting up these comparative categories of value for them to sit in sort of an awkward tension with each other. That a ring which is worth basically nothing can still have a tremendous amount of sentimental affective value for whoever might have used it. So I think that's another one of these like plays with contrast and comparison, and there's like a poetics there that similar to the question of scale we were talking about, that you draw out in a lot of your work.
Yeah, I think assessments and also again, yeah, this assessment in of these objects of sentiment are so important because we're also looking at a lost object in this case. So determining its place and meaning, and also just how that exists just generally in art history. I think, through conservation or through historical research, we're always trying to figure out, what did this mean? What does this signify and symbol throughout this period in time? And for this project, I have three different sets of evaluations which stem monetarily, scientifically, and spiritually. And then the object itself is present, the actual object of loss. And what I found was so important was these three speculations under this, again, this hard truth of the lost object, but also that those three value sets actually sort of determine how we really navigate life, and our like we always kind of go between a sort of spirituality, a truth in I guess science, or a truth in what's a monetarily significant direction for us, and I think that was really what I wanted to spin around this object, and also ask the viewer, like what do you really care to look into? Because when you have this installation, you're presented with a certain amount of rings, and then the viewer kind of becomes this almost archivist or looker, or yeah, the viewer is looking within the piece, and you can stop at a ring and see like, okay, like what's the breakdown here? What am I interested in? Am I interested in something aesthetically, or maybe there's more information about one than the other? And yeah, the availability of information too, whereas the science might yield a very small amount of available truths, but like the spiritual component of this intuitive reader was actually yielding a lot of results because of its type of speculation onto an object. But I mean, I'm always interested in these types of kind of opposing forces and settings within these sentimental objects, or even sites of spectacle, like the when we were speaking about the Pompeii works.
Right, right. Um, I'm also just thinking now that, there's this other sort of additional layer of value that gets created by them then being further transformed into artworks, right? So these are things that are then um, sold again. They're first through this municipal auction, and then after they've been given kind of like the Midas touch of like aesthetic legitimation through the artwork, that they're, reassessed once again in a
Mhm.
totally different way. Um, so they've been subject to you subject them to yet another transformation actually through their presentation here.
Mhm.
Yeah. Um, so I know we're getting down to the last 5 minutes here. Um, so I wanted to finish with the phrase that I saw written in the information about the exhibition at the IFA, which is material memory. And I think, clearly this image, quite explicitly lists some of the memory of each ring um, in a sort of didactic way and quite plain way. Um, but one thing I'm curious about is when you decide to list out this material memory, um, in a very straightforward fashion versus when you let the object breathe, maybe, or when you let its resonances sort of be a little bit more aleatory and spontaneous, and how that process looks like for you when you encounter an object.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can just quickly go to the Pompeii
Sure.
image of, yes, the red on the
It's a good
so this is,
comparison, yeah.
yeah, so this is a good example. This is what I was just kind of bringing up, and as you mentioned as well, um, this isn't let's say a state of an object where I didn't think anything really needed to be done to it, and I also think its setting within an archive was just remarkable and so purposeful. Whereas I would never remove it from its archive or its place in the archive. But basically, this was a photograph, or this is a photograph from a series I have of photographs I had taken at the Archaeological Park of Pompeii. And tourists and visitors would basically take fragments of the archaeological park, and they would be fragments that were incredibly undefinable and very could range from like a little bit of a speck of dust to these rocks, and they would take them and over a period of time feel guilty that they had taken the object or a piece of the archaeological park, and they would return it with a letter of apology. And I thought that action and that reverberation into the site, the fragment coming back into its hole, or I just thought that that was such a compelling movement, and I just wanted to document that object and that sentiment pairing. So this is an example of that, where I let the kind of action just speak through, in this case, a photograph, because I just didn't think it was necessarily necessary to remove this from the archive, because in a fascinating way, this piece of history becomes an imposter to its own place in
Mhm.
the archive, where the archive doesn't know what to do with this because there's no way to maybe tell if this is actually part of the archaeological park or not, or
Right.
it's just fan mail to the
Yeah.
spectacle of Pompeii.
Yeah. And this is a great work, I think, for us to finish off on, because I think it summarizes so much of the kind of central components of your practice. There's bureaucracy involved, work in an archive, the kind of like stunning eruptions of emotion and subjectivity that come through individuals interacting with those systems of our archives and institutions, and then their representation, and collation by you as artworks. So I think that that's a really nice place to end on in a way that sort of brings us back full circle to your work at the IFA. Um, so thanks for being in conversation, Rose. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was such an amazing conversation. We have a few questions, but for anyone in the audience, if you'd like to ask Blake or Rose a question, please feel free to submit a question in the link in the chat. And for the curators as well, we would love to hear from you if you have a question for Rose. let us know. But the first question is from Men. I'll let you unmute Men.
Thank you, Rose and Blake. That was really fascinating. The work, the two works that were in the room to the left when you enter, I found them really fascinating. And the way you described preservation, or the question that you asked about preservation, who gets to preserve and what gets to be preserved within the archive. I thought it was really interesting how there's like a sense of like found objects and language in the two works that are facing one another. And I was wondering if you can speak a little bit more about the two works, what it means to have that sort of like doubling image of doubling like light boxes side by side, but also the two panels like facing one another.
Yeah, maybe would we be able to pull up those two images? Because I actually realized that we didn't really touch too much on that. So thank you for that question. Um, yeah, so these are the conservation reports that I was referring to. And if we just go to a close-up version, I think it might be the next. So I had spent a few weeks looking at these conservation reports that are in the Conservation Center. These are from the students that had gone to the IFA. And I had been really like, how do I describe it? I was almost like a computer in my own eyes. I was just trying to scan for something that resonated with me as a viewer and as an amateur, because I think a big part of a lot of engagements I do, I'm coming in not knowing anything about the field, or knowing a little bit, but not knowing anything technically. And then I start to learn more about um, these skills and fields through actually the information that is sort of left behind, because I can understand, I start to understand the language of it. So as I was going through these reports, I had seen so many repetitious questions of speculation of, the Virgin is standing in this position of the painting, the way a painting is actually described, as in like breaking down a scene that is actually painted. And I was really fascinated by the way that the conservators were also looking. And so I wanted to just lift that language and put it in this sort of messy collage that ranged from handwriting to text, and also sort of in that way, like reviewed the different modes of recording that took place across a 20-year or 25-year period, where you get the technology becoming more prominent within school environments. But this is across from those light boxes. So those light boxes are holding the X-rays that students would also take of objects that they were looking at. And so these X-rays I found as well in the Conservation Center, and these are UV prints onto some light boxes that I was given for the exhibition that were once used by the Institute, but now they're no longer needed. But only because I think that there's often a surplus of light boxes and the recycling of objects. But I thought it was so compelling as to the piercing views that the X-rays had through an object or a painting, and the different levels of, again, truth and question that come in when you're trying to gain a directional uh, or you're trying to gain information about the direction you should go to preserve a piece that you have no idea how that piece was um, like constructed or held or um, handled throughout time. But then this field and the students' conservation field ends up really knowing, and that's also just so incredible, based on science, based on previous reports, based on a sort of a methodology that is quite respected. So I had that bouncing back and forth between those two pieces. And those metal armatures that they're on are sort of also this nod to where how paintings and artworks are stored within museum storage. But it's a little bit designed for the space itself, because this was another restriction where there was just only two screws available here, and I just wanted to have it be a freestanding piece. So
Thank you for that question, Min, and for that answer, Rose. The next question is from GE. GE asks, would you say your work with dynamic sets is a path to understand and manifest an idea in practice of continuity?
I think, yeah, I mean, I would say so. I think what I kind of uh, with the dynamic sets, I'm sort of trying to carve out a new state of the found object where I think that the found object can be so incredibly informative when it's in a accumulation or a group setting, or if it's looked at in that way. Because, we have these, or we're in this position in art history right now where we all work with found objects in different ways. And it's so accustomed when we're showing a work to have a ready-made involved. But I'm really sorry, I don't know if my computer is going in a weird direction, but I'm really interested in the accumulated object, and the forces that grant the forces that grant its accumulation, and that's something that I want to underline more and more as I continue to work with objects. And I think again, auctions are such a great site for that to take place. But I also find them in personal um, archives where I work with the individual very personally, institutionally, and also just peripherally, where there might be a accumulation of objects that people don't really find any value towards. And it could be on the street or, there's a lot of different settings for it. But yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to do with the dynamic set.
Amazing. Thank you for that question, GE. The next question is from an anonymous audience member, and they ask, what does it mean to create works with items with their own histories? For example, objects that were once lost. How did working with the Conservation Center influence the way you approach your work with found objects?
That's a good question, because I think when I was mentioning the Georgia show, for example, dealing with the objects or dealing with diary entries that I wanted to deal with from the Civil War era was very, very tricky because it's revealing very violent and hardcore histories about the United States that require so many, I would say, like, require really delicate and hardcore reading, if that makes sense. Um, and meaning like it just there's so much that one could do, and also one could do with a variety of scholars, or just or people that want to speak about this topic of if it's the Civil War, if it's another very you know previous history that has so much violence in it. I think it's really important that a lot of people want to come together and speak about it. Um, but that so I encounter objects that way, and I'm often tasked with the question of how do you, with the positionality that I hold, how do you deal with this object and what is of interest to you in it? But with the Forbes collection, I would say that that's something also very, in a different way, parallel, where those pigments have very specific histories that one could you could just take one pigment and make an entire um, project out of it. Um, but yeah, I think that when you have an object with a very defined and located history, where it's not just suspended in these places of loss like the rings are, it can be really challenging, but I'm always pushing myself to to really like see the poetics within an object and also to see the truths and the facts within an object as well. And that's why I really like time and even life and death in its concepts really help me look at objects that are very precarious in this way.
Thank you for that answer, Rose. I saw that we have a question from Christina. I didn't know if you wanted to unmute Christina. If not, I can ask on your behalf.
Yeah, I can unmute. Thank you both for such an interesting conversation. It was really a pleasure to work with you, Rose. And I know your pigment photographs come from so much research and that, you considered possibly including text in its presentation and other compositional methods. So I wonder if you could speak more to how you kind of landed on this like asymmetrical theory photo grouping of the pigments. I think it looks really fantastic, and I just would love to hear you say more about that.
Yeah, I think the three the three grid, 3L grid is a suggestion of a continuation of a grid for me, and that it can continue to be added to, and the collection is not complete, or it's never ending in a way. And I had also very much, you were in the class and we were researching all these pigments together, and I was like, how do I incorporate text and information sets with these pretty, simple bottles of pigment? And when you look in art history textbooks or conservation textbooks, you do see this pigment alongside of a large chunk of information. I think this also often comes up as a challenge when I want to explain an object, but then I realize, okay, you don't have to necessarily explain it left to right. You can explain it through. It's just sort of the spirituality that's imbued within the object itself. Like, so all of these photos are almost documents of my first encounters with the object, where there's this sort of aura around the object that for me, it's very compelling, and I become very curious of what this object's potential is. And again, these are bottles of pigments that are not able to be removed from their archive. And also, you wouldn't really want them to be around in public because some of them are a bit toxic, or we don't know how toxic they could be. So that's one answer to the question. But the other one is that I paused with putting text onto these photographs because I have that silk screen of the collage of handwritings, and I thought that that conceptually was a way of encapsulating this surplus of information that ends up happening in an institution's timeline, and also the people that passed through it had been documented. So again, in this way, I think I was like, I'm going to just be a little bit more simple and show the meditation on an object through those photographs. And then in the conservation reports, I can have this manic looking, which is what I've done, and in a very organized and professional manner, which is what the students had done.
Thank you for that question, Christina, and that answer, Rose. The last question is from an anonymous audience member who asked, what were some of the highlights in working with an institution like the IFA, especially working with a class of student curators?
I would say working with this IFA was, I mean, they were very generous with access to the specific archives that I mentioned. Also being able to sit in on classes that were reviewing, the afterlife in Egypt, or just these incredible art history courses. And then with the student curators, I think it was just so helpful for me to be very much vocalizing the process of the practice, but then also having a lot of help with research and navigating information sets, and then logistical aspects as well. And it's also very special to have a group of curators that are very fascinated with the practice, and then we created an entire course around my practice. This is something I've never done, and I think it's very special.
Well, thank you so much, Rose. This was incredible. Thank you, Rose, Blake, Kaleha, Wei, Christina, and Hala. Thank you, Catherine from the Institution of Fine Arts, for your support in preparing for today's event. I'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The REL has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free, join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Takako Yamaguchi and Leah Ullman on the occasion of Innocent Bystanders at Ortazar. And as is Rail tradition, you can now all unmute and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all so much.
Hi, great
Thank
job,
you,
Rose.
Rose. Thank you, Blake.
all.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Rose. Thank you,
Thank
Blake.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
so
you.
much.
And go see the show. Bye, everyone. Bye,
Thank
Blake. Bye,
you.
Rose.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Bye.